At the beginning of the film, the main character in this film is shown, whose name is Dan Chase, aka Henry Dixon, aka Johnny Kohler, aka Peter. Of course, there is something behind the actions of this former CIA sniper, so he has many pseudonyms. After his wife dies, Dan Chase, it's like living alone with just a pair of dogs, the bulldog who is always loyal to him. And Chase has a daughter named Emily, who rarely sees each other, but regularly communicates by phone. Before leaving, Dan Chase blamed the grill for causing the fire. Afterward, Dan Chase goes to the doctor to check his health because he often feels anxious and restless. When out, seeing a car, the firefighters passed in front of him. Dan Chase then moved into a new house with his 2 dogs. He was looking for cans to set up some traditional alarm trap. If someone broke into this house, Dan Chase could hear it. Dan Chase woke up at night and took his gun. Suddenly, 2 dogs pounced on an intruder. Because the perpetrator did not want to give his name, Dan Chase immediately finished him off. After that, he shot the perpetrator's gun into the ceiling so that the police conducting the crime scene would see this incident as an effort for self-protection. To the police, Dan Chase said he was a home businessman, but these police wondered about the appearance of the perpetrators did not resemble robbers. They saw the type of silencer that belonged to the perpetrators, which was very classy. On the way, Dan Chase contacted Emily to tell this incident. He was sure that the perpetrators wanted to hunt him again after a couple of years, and because of that, Dan Chase would limit their communication. Meanwhile, he will go into hiding until the situation is safe, but he can't determine for some time. This older man is Assistant Director of FBI in Counterintelligence named Harold Harper. He is caring for his grandson, but still unclear what makes him lose his daughter and son-in-law. A CIA agent named Raymond Waters contacts Harold because he got an order to find his former crew 30 years ago. If he is still alive, Waters was assigned to catch him. Harold was shocked. Moreover, he knew one of the CIA agents was killed, claiming as Henry Dixon. Dan Chase asks someone's help to looking for a house for him. When in a restaurant, Dan Chase remembers again when he was young with a woman named Beller who joined him as an escapee. At this moment, Dan Chase invited Beller to build a household with him. He promised to always protect Beller from those chasing both of them. And finally, Beller agreed. Dan Chase was shocked when Harold contacted him. His ex-boss claimed to have been asked to be an advisor from the CIA team hunting Dan Chase. This communication was not known to his team, and Harold would explain how he could trace the phone used by Dan Chase. It turned out it was on the back of his tire and had been installed transponder. Dan Chase then follows Harold's directions to drive his car. After 30 years, they haven't met, and Harold already knows about the death of Dan Chase's wife and Dan Chase, who saw the news in the newspapers about the events that caused Harold's daughter and son-in-law to die. Dan Chase was told if at this time a CIA team was following him. Harold then informs his position that he is in the hangar, which is the control center in his arrest operation. With a private plane fully loaded, Harold was sure if Dan Chase could arrive in Kabul, Afghanistan, without transit. The worst scenario he suspects is that Faraz Hamzad wants to meet Dan Chase again by convincing someone from the American government to make this happen. Then, who are the Faraz Hamzad? Harold wants to do something other than this, but Dan Chase only has 2 choices. The first is to hide and find a way to fight, but it will be a nightmare for Dan Chase. With 10,000 agents and a $10 million budget, Harold has full of ammunition to do anything to catch him. Even if he knows about the daughter of Dan Chase, he can use it for his capture mission. Or second, Dan Chase has to disappear, including severing communication with his daughter. Both are between difficult choices. What steps will take by Dan Chase? This man is a CIA agent named Raymond Waters. He wants to know who Harold is called, but adamantly, Harold refuses to tell him. Dan Chase then calls Emily again to call one last time because he doesn't want his daughter to be in danger. It turns out that Emily resolutely rejects her father's decision to run and hide. Even Emily, who doesn't seem like a spoiled child, tells her father to fight them. She doesn't want her father to give up on this situation. But Dan Chase looks like he is already desperate. It can be seen from the monitor screen the team in the field followed Dan Chase until it stopped at a location. The team had lost track, and Harold had thought that his former subordinate would disappear. But this happened. After killing one perpetrator who was hunting him, this grandfather got into a fierce fight with other perpetrators. Finally, Dan Chase, who couldn't do anything, takes under the car. He didn't just give up. Dan Chase took a penknife hidden in his trouser pocket to cut the rope that tied his legs. The vehicle immediately overturned after Dan Chase kicked him. The both of them then fight until the two dogs of Dan Chase come to pounce on this man. And then the scene flashback 30 years ago, when Dan Chase met with Harold to ask for his gun. At that time, Harold was disappointed because Dan Chase was more concerned with this country and even forgot about his identity as a CIA agency. Dan Chase hit again matched to his expertise in removing traces and changing his identity, as well as restoring the condition. This time, he disguised himself as Peter, who rented a house owned by a widow named Zoe. After seeing Peter having a dog, Zoe intends to cancel the rental because she doesn't want her couch damaged. From the plane, Harold immediately met his former boss, who already knew about Faraz Hamzad's plan to avenge him after 30 years. Dan Chase, they knew, was the actual name of Johnny. This older man was Harold's and Johnny's former boss named Morgan Boat. Unexpectedly, Morgan gave him the number of hitman to kill Dan Chase, aka Johnny. To change Zoe's decision to expel him again, Dan Chase cooks his food, which he learned when he was Navy. When Zoe tries it, it turns out that Dan Chase's food is very delicious. In addition, she saw that Dan Chase's two dogs were very obedient, not according to her expectations. Finally, Zoe allowed Dan Chase to rent her house and at the same time be a chef serving food for her. It turns out that Dan Chase still has a bruise on his shoulder from yesterday's attack. The scene then moved to the FBI headquarters. Harold's men's agent Angela is quite considerate. She advised him to focus on caring for his grandson at home because she knew about the disaster that occurred to his daughter and son-in-law. But he refused because hunting Dan Chase duties were assigned to his team. He told Joe and Angela their target had a daughter, so they got orders to find her. Dan Chase is shocked when Zoe asks him out for dinner. Emily disapproves when her father tells her Zoe asked him out, though Dan Chase doesn't reveal his true identity and the big problem he is facing. At this moment, they told each other the story of their life that could glue their hearts. Agent Waters met Angela at the FBI headquarters because he was involved in this hunt. Angela had confided that Harold had educated and protected her since she joined the FBI. When Waters told Angela, it was revealed that Faraz Hamzad were warlords in Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion. His right hand was a sniper CIA who sided with Afghanistan and could shoot a general from a distance of 915 meters. Reportedly, he also attacked the Soviet Army headquarters, felling 12 people in the silence of the night. In the valley of Afghanistan, they called him Baba the Omnivore, means a beast that eats everything. And rumor is this Baba is a former agent of CIA named Dan Chase. While Harold was at that time the head of the Muslim People headquarters overseeing CIA's support for the Mujahideen. While on their way home, the police intercepted Zoe to check her driver's license and registration. When Dan Chase saw the police stare intently at him, this former sniper killed them quickly, even forcing him to kill Zoe. But in fact, it was just thoughts of Dan Chase. These police only told him to drive because Zoe was identified as just drank alcohol. The next day, Angela reported to Harold that Dan Chase's daughter, Emily, died of suicide in 2003. It's clear here that Emily has faked her death because we know she is so intensely calling her father. Besides that, Harold secretly called the hitman recommended by Morgan. Even he has got hold of his hideout, which is in this Zoe's house. It is the look of a professional hitman named Julian Carson, who Harold contacted to eliminate Dan Chase. Harold and Waters, who were at FBI headquarters, deployed the SWAT team to the target location to arrest Dan Chase. But Waters felt a lot of things Harold was covering up related to the mission they were carrying out. Back to the past in Afghanistan, when Dan Chase, aka Johnny close to the warlord Faraz Hamzad. Johnny convinced Faraz that he must send the weapons to fight the enemies of Afghanistan, even though the CIA refused. Because Johnny was so adamant about joining the fight, Faraz ordered Dan Chase to convince his wife. It also turned out that Beller, who participated in Johnny's escape, was Faraz's wife. Back to the present time, Dan Chase tells Zoe that he has to leave this place immediately. Because he feels close, Dan Cash invites her to accompany him to Montana, but Zoe refuses because she has much to do in this city. Here, Zoe begins to realize that Peter, she knows, is a fugitive. Zoe feels that she has been lied to and is worried that she will also become a target. When Emily calls again, she wants to talk to Zoe. Emily tells her life story. She was born to parents hiding from running away with various pseudonyms. What's in a name? Because the most important thing is kindness they did, and the suffering they reduced, and the lives they saved. She knew well that both her parents sacrificed themselves for a struggle. It is revealed here that the figure of Emily is an FBI agent, Angela Adam. Emily leaves her decision to Zoe. Whether she wants to go with her father or not, it doesn't matter. The most important thing is that Emily has explained the actual figure of Dan Chase. When Zoe got into the car, she heard gunshots. It turned out that there was a bullet hole in the window, and inside, Dan Chase was struggling to defend his life from a hitman. Zoe immediately took out Dan Chase's dogs to help. Dan Chase immediately shot that hitman. After that incident, Dan Chase couldn't let Zoe go because it was dangerous for her safety. On a different side, the FBI team calculated the arrival time of the SWAT team in about 15 minutes to the hiding location of Dan Chase. The reconnaissance team used aerial vision using a UAV drone showing a car leaving the target location. Dan Chase took out his gun to shoot the reconnaissance drone. At that time, Fares introduced Johnny to his wife, Beller. Not just a housewife. It turns out that Beller is a tough woman who fought for her country and nation from Soviet colonialism. With a firm tone, Beller wants to know what contribution this CIA agent has to the government. Johnny said that 4 chests of the M21 weapon were on the way, but Beller still thinks that's just an ordinary thing, and she is sure Johnny is just a regular shooter who can finish off enemies from a distance of no more than 200 meters. But it turns out that Johnny is a professional sniper who can shoot enemies on target from a distance of 900 meters. Because it is not difficult for Dan Chase to paralyze drones with his gun, because their targets are not random people, Harold finally opened up the facts to this CIA agent. Fares could get whatever he wanted from the American government. He was very sure that Fares wanted Dan Chase to be arrested alive because 30 years ago, Dan Chase stole Fares's wife. And at that time, Harold helped him. Suddenly behind, Angela heard Harold's story even when Harold badmouthed her parents. For not accepting, Emily cuts off Harold's conversation because according to her, Dan Chase was the radical person who believed he was on the right side. This agent then suggested they ask Fares directly so that everything would be clear what his true purpose. The SWAT team, who was already at the target's house, found no one besides the window glass that was perforated by bullets. Because of her statement, Waters felt that Angela was hiding something in this chase. And if that were true, he would try to dig it. Here it was clear the look on Harold's face indicated the hitman he had assigned failed. It turned out that the hitman Dan Chase shot was still alive and in a car with his partner. And it was revealed that Beller is the daughter of 2 professors who teach at Ohio. It's not strange that Beller is very smart. Because of the coup d'etat, Beller failed to move there and chose to become a fighter. Suddenly, a plane is seen from afar, took down the weapons promised by Johnny. It is when Beller and Johnny start to like each other. And after that, the scene shows Dan Chase expelling Zoe from the luggage. This widow looked scared because she realized she was with a fugitive most wanted by the CIA and the FBI. Dan Chase gave directions to Zoe to tell the news to her son if she was okay. Dan Chase then continues his escape with Zoe. 3 days later, Harold needs help detecting Dan Chase's presence. The next day, he invited Angela to meet the lawyer of Fares Hamzat. Harold was surprised when he heard Angela's response about Dan Chase and his wife. Angela keeps her identity secret, that she is Dan Chase's daughter. Angela secretly contacted her father because tomorrow, she would be meeting with Fares's lawyer named Nina Kruger. Dan Chase convinced his daughter that Fares thought Angela's mother was his mind. Because of that, Fares took revenge and did all this plan. Did Angela believe this simple reason? Or was there another fact hidden by her father? The next day, Dan Chase changed his identity to Henry Dixon, while Zoe was Marcia Dixon, who was also used to disguise his late wife's identity. Because Zoe was forced to participate in this escape, Dan Chase promised compensation worth $500,000. Even though they were furious and didn't want to talk much, Zoe could not help but have to accept this fact. They then occupied an apartment that Dan Chase had lived. When Dan Chase was young, we talked at Fares's house. And then Beller, who had just returned from the battlefield, almost fell from exhaustion. One of the Afghan men came to give testimony of the cruelty of the Soviet soldiers who massacred his family. Beller counted 300 troops and modern weaponry to destroy 1 Soviet headquarters. And here, Dan Chase proposed himself to sneaky there to kill the soldiers as a form of revenge for what they have done. Harold assigned these 2 hitmen on Morgan's orders, but their first action failed because they underestimated the target. Julian then contacted Harold to tell him that an insider gave information to the target that caused their mission to fail. Harold was immediately surprised when he heard it. Harold, accompanied by Angela and Waters, meets Fares's lawyer named Nina, who already knows about the failed arrest of Dan Chase. This FBI team wants to know what Faraz wants from Dan Chase. Here, Harold opens the fact of Dan Chase's relationship with the first wife of Faraz. Nina initially didn't believe it because she had spent 10 years working for Faraz and knowing all access to his most confidential information. But after Harold mentioned the woman's name, it was Beller, not only Nina, who was shocked, but also Angela, who was Beller's daughter. At that time, Faraz loved and admired Beller, who had an intelligent mind, until Faraz thought of her as the most trusted advisor. But his feelings immediately changed when Beller betrayed and left him for a man named Dan Chase, who was then named Johnny. Finally, Nina promised to contact Faraz and ask them to wait. That night, Dan Chase and Beller began to act. Amid heavy rain and booming sounds, Dan Chase slaughtered the Soviet soldiers one by one, and also with Beller. An enemy army commander caught Dan Chase's target. When Zoe gets a call from Henry's assistant, Stuart, it seems Zoe has a plan because Henry owns a company. Henry meets one of his workers with a vital position named Zach. Henry asks Zach for help regarding equity investment in mining and metallurgy arson to be met with their director general called Suleiman Pavlovich. Zach was quite surprised because Henry asked to be scheduled the next day. In the past, Dan Chase, who proved his loyalty to General Faraz, dragged one of the commanders from the Soviet army. An old woman appeared in the shadows who said, Dan Chase will become a monster like Suleiman Pavlovich at the beginning of an end, after waiting for Harold and his team to return to meet Nina. She expressed the client's response because this problem was quite surprising, from starting to get angry, frustrated, and so on. If Harold wanted to know more about this case, Faraz told them to get on the private jet, which would fly in 1 hour. Pranking. Faraz threatens to hand out a memorandum so that Harold is responsible for everything that happened. While waiting for the plane, Angela secretly calls her father in the toilet. Dan Chase strictly forbids Emily from getting on the plane because he doesn't want Emily to be in a more dangerous situation. Emily realizes that Harold is already suspicious of her, but she doesn't like what she has sacrificed so far to disappear. After that, she threw away her SIM card to prevent the hacking. Waters didn't want to get on the plane because he had a boss, and according to him, this step was out of the corridor. Different from Harold, who felt that he had become Angela's father, who wanted his daughter to get on the plane. Zoe, who currently holds the status of Marcia, filed for divorce for Henry through a letter she would send to the company's board. She knew that her fake husband was one of the owners of a financial company. If Dan Chase wanted Zoe to stay with him, he gave her half of his property. His emotions provoked because Zoe planned to blackmail him. On the private jet, Harold didn't want to talk at all until Angela lured him, even though they knew where to take by this plane. It turned out that Harold already knew if Angela, who is considered his daughter, was Emily, Dan Chase's daughter. They are involved in an argument because they both feel lied to. Harold expresses his disappointment because Angela is an informant for Dan Chase. Meanwhile, Dan Chase gives Marcia's account to Zoe so she can take half of the money she wants. This former CIA agent reasoned that he didn't mind the money because right now, the most important thing was his daughter's safety, who was in a dangerous situation. Dan Chase plans to fly to Morocco, and if Zoe wants to go with him, Dan Chase will tell everything. The Russian soldiers who are hostages by Faraz are beaten mercilessly. To get information about what the Russian plans are for Afghanistan, Johnny intends to go to the border to find information from the CIA about what happened here. But Beller forbade him. She was worried that everything they had built would be in vain when the Russian soldier spoke to Faraz then. Johnny was shocked by Faraz's wife's statement, but she promised to explain later. At night, when Faraz was sleeping secretly, Beller met Johnny. It revealed here that Beller was a Soviet spy who was given the name of a GRU and held an important information in a village and valley that she kept the name secret. At that location, mineral deposits containing lithium and uranium were discovered, whose value was unimaginable, so that they could change the country's economy. That is the place that the Soviets are after. With the mine, Faraz Hamzad could become the next president of Afghanistan. Beller deliberately told her husband because she didn't want to be Faraz's king, who is greedy and dark-eyed. Because of that, Beller needs Johnny's help to keep this secret. That's one of the reasons the commander of the Afghan wants to chase Dan Chase. Remember, another significant cause will be revealed at the end of the film. Dan Chase says this fact to Zoe so she can better understand the problem. Angela expresses her feelings that Dan Chase and Harold are both parents who have raised and educated her. Because of that, she cannot be sided with one of them. Angela refuses to give his father to Harold because she knows Harold has sent a hitman to kill him. Angela would not mind that because she knew Harold had helped her father escape from Faraz. This thing shocked Angela when she discovered her mother's birth name in Harold's mouth in front of Faraz's lawyer, so Harold knew the reaction from Angela. Felt his life was not much longer. Dan Chase handed over his 2 beloved bulldogs to an animal shelter. The barking of those dogs was a symbol that they would part with their master. After this problem, Dan Chase promised Zoe she would return to her everyday life. Waters received an order from Commander CIA that someone would contact him. He had to obey his orders no matter what, and Waters was forbidden to ask or dig up information about him. It turned out that the person who contacted him was Morgan, who assigned Waters and Julian to look for Harold's whereabouts, because Morgan knew that Waters was the last to see him. Julian was surprised when Morgan said the person who placed the informant near Harold was himself at the request of Dan Chase. Even though Dan Chase and Harold were considered his children, Morgan was planning to hurt them now. After the plane landed, Harold suspected that they were in Africa. The pilot and the co-pilot left without saying anything. Harold guessed this was the last time Faraz lost track of Angela's mother. Soon, an older man came to guide them, because at lunch earlier, Zach refused to help Dan Chase arrange a meeting with Suleiman, and this time he came to threaten him immediately. Zoe offers herself to persuade Zach in her way. Initially, Zach refused when Zoe asked for his help, but she knocked on the door again to understand her request regarding this critical matter. Harold and Angela were directed to a document room as a form of examination from Faraz to find the flight schedule from Karachi, Pakistan again, in 1987, carrying the parents of Angela. Harold knows all of this because he is the one who arranged it in secret. After getting it, Harold immediately told Faraz's lawyer. Also, Nina asked for the bill of lading of passengers along with their seat numbers. When Harold mentioned numbers 7A and 7B, apparently Nina was satisfied. Because of that, a memorandum detailing all of Harold's mistakes will be disseminated soon. When Harold is angry because his career will be ruined, Angela tells him that her father is planning to kill Faraz. Therefore, Harold should find and help him. Besides that, Dan Chase and Zoe are seen already on the plane to Morocco to meet Pavlovich. While Harold is driving Angela to the bank, he calls his wife, and it turns out that Morgan is there. After placing Angela as an informant nearby, Morgan planned to bring Angela back from him, but Harold refused this time. Not far from the location, Waters, Julian, and Mike carry out the task from Morgan to kidnap Angela. Dan Chase then came to the bank to ask for a stroke of his account balance. It turns out that from the code number, Emily told him she was fine and was on her way here. When traveling by train to Morocco, Harold knew that Angela was sending her secret messages to Dan Chase through an account balance. Angela admitted that she often made phone calls with him, even though she last met her father in 2012. Because it was too dangerous, Angela could not attend her mother's funeral. While on a fast boat, Dan Chase plans to remind Pavlovich, so he wants to help him kill Faraz. When the film flashbacks to when Johnny decides to free the Soviet soldiers, he is Pavlovich. A soldier who is being held hostage is sure the person in front of him is the monster of Faraz that he is afraid of by his friends. Johnny then freed this soldier so that Beller's secret was awake. Faraz was not stupid to feel betrayed, but he did not accuse Beller at this moment. He knew that his wife often wandered around at night. He understood that a new mystery would appear when solving puzzles with his wife, even though Faraz still loves her. Arriving at the meeting place, Dan Chase writes something on the paper to remind Pavlovich again. After he read it, Dan Chase invited me to come into his room. Arriving at the station, Harold was surprised because several FBI agents were waiting. It turns out that Angela contacted them to take Harold back. Angela wants him to replace her position to fight Faraz with the help of her father. She feels that there is no place, and Harold obeys her. Suddenly, he crosses paths with Julian, who he doesn't know. He is the hitman he ordered. However, seeing Water who is there, then Harold realizes that Angela is in danger. When he returns to his previous place, it is fitting that Angela is not there anymore. While waiting, Zoe is shocked because this woman knows her real identity. It turns out that on that paper, Dan Chase wrote Baba, Faraz's executioner who saved his life. Apparently, at that time, Beller was trained by Pavlovich to become a Soviet spy. He says that Pavlovich first met Beller on one of the campuses in Moscow. He claimed he fell in love with her, but his father is a GRU or military intelligence Soviet and forbade him to have a relationship further. It was surprising to him. It turned out that Faraz's lawyer had pressured Pavlovich to hand over Dan Chase to Faraz. Dan Chase swiftly killed 2 of his men in seconds. but he released the former agent of this GRU for the second time. When Nine offered to cooperate with Zoe, suddenly chaos ensued because the security forces were chasing Dan Chase. Arriving at the harbor, it turns out that Harold and the FBI team managed to find Dan Chase. Harold wants to invite Dan Chase to save their daughter from Morgan. It was seen Angela unconscious at the hidden location in Waters' hand, Julian and Mike, assigned by Morgan. It turned out to be Julian and Mike, ex-Special Forces American. Mike, watching from behind the hole, felt something was odd out there. When Harold contacted Waters, he knew if Angela was there as a guarantee. Morgan told Faraz to prepare the plane on the nearest tarmac. If Dan Chase comes in, Emily will be let go, but if he refuses, Emily will take him to Faraz Hamzat. This FBI agent says Faraz has allies in FBI officials. For his daughter's safety, Dan Chase is willing to get on the plane. At that time, Faraz knows that Beller and Johnny helped escape Soviet prisoners. Beller finally uncovered the facts about a location containing enough uranium to turn the course of war into victory and prosperity. Beller reasoned that she didn't want her husband to be seduced by his desire for power and greed. Faraz was disappointed in his wife because there should be nothing to hide to him. Beller still refused even though Faraz threatened her. Right away, Dan Chase was kicked out of Faraz's house. Because of that, Dan Chase asked Harold's help to get him out of Afghanistan. Waters tries to convince Julian they are in the wrong position because Morgan has used them. Harold is looking for information again from Dan Chase about what happened when he and Beller fled to America. Because of the information he gave about the flight, Faraz did not satisfy. But Dan Chase didn't want to tell the truth. He needed to know this information because Angela or Emily would have demanded it. Harold was shocked when Dan Chase told him about Pavlovich, a Soviet intelligence officer who trained his wife for years. And then she was sent into the field to be Faraz's wife. That woman was Beller, and it was here Dan Chase realized that his wife was also using him to be able to escape. The conclusion was Beller was already married to a Soviet intelligence, then the Afghan warlord, and lastly CIA agent. Harold gives the task to the team to follow him after Waters reports a threat from another party. They suspected that Hamzat wanted to take Angela from their hands. When Mike saw several enemies and snipers watching their locations, Julian jumped into action. One by one, he finished. And the last was killed by the sniper hiding in the room. That's when Mike and Waters took Angela out of there. Suddenly, an older woman standing in the middle of the road intercepted their car, and the woman immediately shot them. Harold, heading to Angela's location, was ordered by someone far away, in position above them, to return to the runway. They both refused and chose to paralyze the agents escorting them to free Angela from Hamzat. With a few shots, Dan Chase managed to bring down their car. Arriving at the location, they found the car, but Mike and Waters died. At the same time, Angela was not in the car. It is where Dan Chase told Harold the actual story. When Harold helped provide 2 plane tickets to fly to America, Dan Chase and Beller brought one extra passenger he didn't know about. Dan Chase could have killed Faraz easily on the night of the escape, but he couldn't do it in front of Faraz's daughter, who was also brought along on Dan Chase and Beller's flight. And this is Faraz Hamzat, who is getting old, as well as Dan Chase and Harold. The conclusion is that the commander of Afghan wants to get his daughter back after 30 years of being taken away by his wife. And this is the figure of his biological daughter, which is nothing else as Angela, aka Emily, and her birth name is Parwana. At the same time, Dan Chase and Harold are just a father who raises and educates her. And after that, the film ends.